How Hannibal made 80,000 Romans destroy themselves in one afternoon battle of Cannae on the 2nd day of August in the year 216 before Christ. A Carthaginian commander who had never lost a battle met a Roman general who had never questioned his own judgment. By sunset, one of them had set a standard for military brilliance that would echo through every war college on Earth for the next 22 centuries. The other had presided over a catastrophe so complete that the word for it, annihilation, would become synonymous with tactical masterwork. This is the story of how Hannibal Barca turned impossible odds into a masterclass in human destruction, and why that afternoon in southern Italy remains the most perfectly executed battle trap in military history. The stage was set not by accident, but by desperation. For 3 years, Hannibal had been carving his way through Roman territory like a blade through silk. He had crossed the Alps with war elephants in the dead of winter. He had shattered Roman armies at the Trebbia River and Lake Trasimeno, each victory methodical, each one driving deeper into the Italian peninsula. Rome was hemorrhaging. The Senate was panicked. And in their panic, they made a choice that Hannibal had been waiting for. They gave supreme command of their armies to Gaius Terentius Varro, a man whose confidence in the superiority of Roman numbers far exceeded his understanding of Roman tactics. Let us step back to the war table. The Aufidus River runs through Apulia in southeastern Italy, a shallow stream that barely deserves the name river in summer. But it offered something crucial, a natural boundary, a line drawn across the landscape. On the morning of August 2nd, Hannibal positioned his army with the Aufidus at his back. He had perhaps 50,000 men under his command. Some were Libyan heavy infantry, the hardened core of his force. Some were Numidian cavalry, riders whose skill on horseback was legendary. Some were Gallic and Spanish warriors whose ferocity was as reliable as the sunrise. But he was outnumbered. The Roman army marching toward him numbered 80,000 soldiers, nearly 2 to 1. On the surface, the mathematics should have been simple. Rome should have won. Instead, Hannibal had engineered something far more dangerous. He had created conditions where Rome's superior numbers would become Rome's funeral pyre. Varro, upon seeing the Carthaginian army arrayed before him, did not hesitate. He did not consult. He did not consider that a general who had never lost a battle might have reasons for standing in such a seemingly vulnerable position. What he saw was an army smaller than his own, positioned with what appeared to be weak discipline, with a center that looked dangerously thin. What he saw was victory. Roman soldiers, too, felt it. They had been marched for weeks. They were hot, angry, and eager to finish what the previous generals had failed to complete. Varro gave the order to advance. Now we must understand the mechanics of ancient warfare to understand what happened next. When armies of this scale met in open field, they did not move as unified organisms. They moved in formations, in phalanxes and lines that needed to maintain cohesion or risk disintegration. The Roman legions advanced in their standard order, heavy infantry in the center, cavalry on the wings. The noise of 80,000 men moving forward, the clink of armor, the thud of footsteps, the roar of thousands of voices must have been like the approach of an earthquake. Dust rose in a vast cloud. The morning heat amplified the thirst and the fear. Hannibal's center bent backward. This is the crucial moment. Chroniclers claimed he had positioned his Gallic and Spanish infantry in the middle of his line in a convex formation, deliberately thin, a crescent moon shape with the curve pointing outward toward Rome. As the Roman advance pressed into this line, the center gave ground. It did not break. It bent. Varro saw this retreat and interpreted it as exactly what he expected, the collapse of an inferior force. He pressed forward harder. His entire army surged into the gap, deeper into the Carthaginian position, eager to roll up the flanks and destroy the enemy completely. This is where Hannibal's trap had teeth. While Roman eyes were fixed on the retreating center, while Roman momentum carried them forward in a blind advance fueled by anticipated victory, something was happening on the flanks that Varro could not fully see. Hannibal's African heavy infantry, his elite troops, the ones he had been reserving, were positioned on the right and left wings, perpendicular to the Roman advance. As the Roman center drove deeper into the Carthaginian position, these African troops began to wheel inward. The crescent had inverted. What was concave from outside now became convex from within. The Romans were no longer advancing into a gap. They were pushing deeper into a pocket, and the walls of that pocket were closing. The cavalry completed the transformation. Numidian and Carthaginian horsemen, having routed the Roman cavalry on the flanks during the initial engagement, now wheeled around behind the entire Roman army. The encirclement was complete. 80,000 Romans found themselves surrounded in open field, packed so densely that men in the inner ranks could barely raise their swords. The dust cloud that had announced their advance now imprisoned them. The summer heat that had fueled their aggression now became a suffocating blanket. They could not retreat because there was nowhere to go. They could not advance because enemy troops blocked every direction. They could not even die easily, because being surrounded meant each man had enemies on all sides. What followed was not a battle. It was slaughter. The Romans tried to maintain formation, tried to follow their training and their discipline, but discipline cannot save you when you have been trapped by a commander of genius. They fought. Chroniclers estimated that 50,000 to 70,000 Romans died in the closing hours of that afternoon, though the exact number remains debated by historians. What is not debated is the scale of the catastrophe. By the time the sun set on the battlefield, Hannibal had destroyed the largest Roman army ever assembled at that point in history, while suffering perhaps 6,000 casualties among his own men. The mathematics that should have guaranteed Rome's victory had instead guaranteed her greatest defeat. The question that echoes through the centuries is simple. How was this possible? The answer requires us to understand something that separates adequate military commanders from the truly great ones. Varro saw the battlefield as a place where victory belonged to the side with larger numbers. Hannibal saw the battlefield as a three-dimensional space where terrain, time, and psychology could be manipulated to make those numbers irrelevant. He understood that in a battle, an army is not a unified blob of power but a network of dependencies. Soldiers need to see their commanders. Flanking units need to support the center. Reserves need space to move. Morale depends on hope. If you can disrupt all of these things simultaneously, numbers cease to matter. The wind and dust played their role too. Chroniclers noted that the dust rose from the Roman advance, blowing into Roman faces, further obscuring what was happening on the periphery. Hannibal had positioned his army knowing the prevailing winds would work in his favor. Every detail mattered. The Aufidus River at his back meant the Romans could not outflank him in one direction, forcing them into a more compressed formation, making the encirclement tighter and more deadly. The positioning of units, the timing of the wheeling maneuver, the reserve that Hannibal held back and committed exactly when the trap was closing. These were not accidents. They were the products of a mind that had spent years studying how armies move and how they break. What made Cannae resonate through history was not simply its scale or its completeness. It was that Hannibal achieved it while outnumbered. It was that he did it in open field against a numerically superior opponent who had no geographical weakness to exploit, no city walls to hide behind, nowhere to escape to except through the annihilation of everything around him. It was that he did it using a technique, the double envelopment, the pincer movement, that became the template for military excellence. Every commander who came after studied Cannae. Every war college taught Cannae. Napoleon studied the battle. Frederick the Great studied the battle. Military academies from West Point to Sandhurst, to every institution concerned with the study of strategy returned again and again to this single afternoon in 216. The practical reason for this is brutal and mathematical. Cannae demonstrates that battles are not won by simple accumulation of force, but by the intelligent application of force in time and space. It shows that deception, psychological manipulation, and an accurate reading of your enemy's thinking are worth multiples of the difference in raw numbers. It reveals that the most dangerous trap is the one the enemy sets for himself by following his own expectations. Varro expected victory because he had numbers. His very expectation, his absolute certainty, became his blind spot. Hannibal simply looked at that blind spot and stepped into it, then closed a door the Roman general had not even seen. But there is something else worth understanding. Cannae won a battle. It did not win the war. The destruction was so complete that Rome's immediate military threat was effectively eliminated for months. Hannibal marched on Rome itself, or at least as far as the suburbs, and the Romans watched from behind their walls as the Carthaginian army camped on their doorstep. But Rome did not surrender. The city mobilized, reorganized, and eventually, through years of grinding warfare, wore down the Carthaginian threat. Cannae stands as a perfect example of tactical brilliance, but also as a reminder that even the most masterfully executed battle must serve a larger strategic purpose. Hannibal won every battle he ever fought in Italy, but Rome won the war. Strategy sits above tactics. The grander picture controls the smaller frame. Yet the fact remains that on one afternoon, in one bounded space of geography and time, a general of extraordinary gifts arranged a trap so perfect, so complete, so mathematically elegant, that human beings were caught in it and could not escape. 2/3 of an army ceased to exist in the span of a few hours. The precision required for such a maneuver, the timing, the intelligence of reconnaissance to know enemy movements in advance, the discipline of troops to execute a complex wheeling maneuver in the middle of the chaos of battle. These things place Cannae in a special category. It is not merely a military victory. It is an intellectual achievement. It is proof that the mind can sometimes be worth more than the sword, that understanding, truly understanding, how your enemy thinks and moves can turn the entire calculus of power upside down. The soldiers who died at Cannae died because their general underestimated his opponent. They died because they were obedient to orders that were based on false confidence. They died because, in the end, human beings in formation can be maneuvered like pieces on a board when someone understands the game well enough. It is not a pleasant thing to understand, but it is the truth that every military institution that followed has had to reckon with. The tragedy and the genius of Cannae are inseparable. The same thing that made it brilliant made it deadly. Hannibal did not change the rules of warfare because he was stronger or had better equipment. He changed the perception of what was possible because he thought differently. When you study the great battles of history, you return again and again to a handful of moments where everything crystallizes, where the potential of military genius finds perfect expression against the backdrop of open ground and the limitations of human perception. Cannae is perhaps the purest example. It required not the advantage of terrain, but its mastery. It required not numerical superiority, but superior understanding. It required not luck, but preparation so meticulous that luck became irrelevant. Hannibal spent weeks in the region around Cannae, studying the winds, observing the river, understanding the dust patterns, learning what every general before him had overlooked. The afternoon of August 2nd, 216 before Christ, belongs to him. The Romans who fought there belonged to their moment, and their courage is recorded in the slaughter itself. But the victory, absolute and complete, belongs entirely to the mind that conceived it. And that is why, more than 2,000 years later, we still call it a masterpiece. Not because it was beautiful, it was not. Not because it advanced civilization or solved great problems, it did nothing of the sort. But because it was perfectly, impossibly, utterly complete. 80,000 men did not simply lose that battle. They became part of a demonstration of what becomes possible when one human being truly understands the landscape, the physics of movement, and the weaknesses in another human being's thinking. This is the power of Cannae. It teaches that dominion over the battlefield is not given by heaven or chance or superior numbers. It is seized by those willing to think differently, to see what is invisible to others, and to wait with patience until the moment arrives when all the pieces align. That moment came on